Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, Composting for the Climate. My name is Kate Hodgson, and I'm the Digital Events Coordinator for Farmfolk Cityfolk. I'm also going to be the moderator for tonight's conversation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And since we have folks joining us from across the province and beyond, I would like to invite you to take a moment to acknowledge in your own way the caretakers of those lands as well. I would also like to acknowledge that the work that Farmfolk Cityfolk does within the colonial borders of British Columbia is in service of a food system that was not traditionally adopted by many of these nations. And so while we promote our colonially introduced system as a sustainable and environmentally sensitive approach to food production, it is so critical that we ground ourselves in the knowledge that traditional food systems still exist and continue to be put at risk by agricultural and industrial development. So as we explore the topic of composting, I invite us all to consider how we might support Indigenous communities working to protect their food systems and take collective ownership for dismantling the barriers that keep Indigenous communities from having reliable access to good and culturally relevant food. So today's webinar is hosted by Farmfolk Cityfolk and is part of our Engaging Eaters Climate and Food Story series. Farmfolk Cityfolk is BC's oldest and largest food and agriculture nonprofit organization, and we work to connect, empower, and inspire people to strengthen BC's food systems. Now, you've heard a little bit about us, but we'd also love to hear about you. So our wonderful tech support, Coe, is going to launch a poll, and we welcome you to take a moment to fill that out and tell us a little bit more about yourselves and where you're calling in from. So today's webinar is titled Composting for the Climate, and today we will explore the role of compost in climate mitigation alongside practical strategies for urban dwellers to step up their composting efforts. We are so delighted to have Kayla Siefried from the Compost Education Center and Dr. Sean Smuckler from the UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems here to share their expertise with us. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Sean Smuckler. Dr. Sean Smuckler is currently the Principal Investigator of the SAL Lab, Associate Professor and Chair of Agriculture and Environment in Land and Food Systems at UBC. He has extensive experience researching ways to lessen the environmental impact of agriculture and food systems at large through regenerative and stewardship practices. Sean holds a PhD in ecology from the University of California, an MS in forest soils from the University of Washington, and a BC in environmental biology and management from the University of California. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sean.
Well over 20 years. And for some of us, we've been really focusing our research on this for the last 10 years. But this year has been an exceptional year for getting attention to this subject. I think it was a real wake-up call when people went to the grocery store this year or at the beginning of the pandemic and saw empty shelves. And that was a real jarring situation for many people. And this is what scientists have been predicting would be an outcome of the changing climate. So we are for sure going to see shifting precipitation patterns. We're going to be seeing changes in temperatures around the world and a variable climate. And this is most impactful of all economic sectors to farmers. They are on the front line of this challenge. In some places, climate change is going to be beneficial in some ways. So in the Fraser Valley, for example, it's expected that temperatures may increase. And with that increase in temperatures, we may see increased growing degree days and a greater variety of crops, more productivity. But with that, we also might see pests that we haven't seen in the past, additional challenges that were things that we hadn't thought about previously. It also means that we're going to see shifting weather patterns. We expect that precipitation is going to change, both in terms of the overall precipitation that we will see in our province, but also in terms of how much is snow. And snow is a really important part of the way we store water in this province for our agriculture. Basically, it's the place where our irrigation water gets saved until we need it. So it's clear that Canada the world, in fact, is recognizing this finally as a really important challenge to address as a global community. And Canada has made some really ambitious targets. So in this graph, we're showing basically where we are here at roughly a little above 700 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents of greenhouse gas emissions per year. And we've committed to reducing that down to nearly 500 by 2030. So in a very short amount of time, we're going to drop our emissions enormously. But this isn't even the biggest change that we're committing to. So when we zoom out a little bit and look at our target for 2050, we've committed to zero emissions. And to get from way up here to way down here, we need pretty much all economic sectors, all participants in our community to do their part to help with this reduction commitment. So right now, agriculture is roughly 10% of Canadian agricultural emissions. And while that might seem like a small amount, it certainly is, it's substantial. Globally, it's estimated that 13% of direct emissions come from agriculture. And then when we take into account the amount of emissions that can be attributed to agriculture when tropical forests, for example, come down, this emission target or this emission number jumps enormously to 24%. So Canada not only has an important role in reducing its own emission, but we actually are an important supplier of food globally. So where do those emissions come from? So this graphic is illustrating the various sources of emissions in agriculture, and the size of the arrows are indicating the relative contribution. So actually, a majority of our emissions come from enteric fermentation from ruminants, from dairy cattle and beef cattle. The next biggest emitter comes from nitrous oxide. So the nitrous oxide is a byproduct when we add nutrients to our system, when we add nitrogen that our plants need. And when that's used inefficiently, that nitrogen is a powerful greenhouse gas. Manure management is an important one. This also is related to the dairy and beef production, but also poultry production. And on-farm fossil fuel and energy use is important. Another important component of this graphic is showing the exchange of carbon dioxide with the soil. So not only can we be emitting greenhouse gases, we can actually be pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So you'll notice that there's a bunch of labels here with representing different greenhouse gases. So methane and nitrous oxide are really powerful greenhouse gases, as well as carbon dioxide. But when we look at them in comparison to their ability to force the climate, to change the temperature of our climate, we see that nitrous oxide is almost 300 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So this graph is showing the relative climate forcing capacity of these gases compared to carbon dioxide. So methane, not quite as powerful as nitrous oxide, but certainly a really important component of our emission factor. So in a recent analysis that we did in the Lower Fraser Valley, led by a PhD student in my lab, Siddhartha Paul, we measured and modeled changes in soil organic carbon. So this is the carbon that's been locked away in our soils. And we modeled this using satellite imagery and statistical approaches, geostatistical approaches, and predicted a change in soil organic carbon from 1984 through 2018, showing that there were areas where that the soil organic carbon actually increased, showing that we pulled carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locked it away in the soil. 27% of the landscape was unchanged. what was really concerning was this 61% where we observed a decline, which represents a fairly sizable amount of emissions over that period of time. Across Canada, we see that there are some places that are doing really well in terms of pulling atmospheric carbon and putting it into the soil. So in the prairies and overall in Canada, we see that we are increasing our soil organic carbon. Whereas in other parts of Canada, we see declines in soil organic carbon. And here in BC, you see it's a bit flat. So at least in some parts of our province, maybe we're gaining carbon, but certainly in the lower Fraser Valley, we're not. So it's critical that we not only turn this trend around for climate change, but also for the productivity of our crops. So using compost is actually a really important way that we can help address this problem. So compost can be a really important greenhouse gas beneficial management practice, and it can really affect these three areas. So in terms of manure management, nitrous oxide from soils, and carbon dioxide that we're putting back into the soil. So composting can be a really important component of what is now being labeled as regenerative agriculture. The idea of using a set of agricultural practices, composting and incorporating compost in the soil as one of the key components of this type of practice. So you're improving the soil health by increasing carbon in the soil, but you're also reducing reliance on outside resources, so fertilizer from other parts of the country, from really energy intensive sources. And it's also restoring ecological function, not only from the field, but all the way up to the landscape. So this idea has really taken off. So in 2015, at the meeting of the global community, leadership from around the world gathered in Paris, signed an accord, committing our countries to these really ambitious emission reduction programs. And at the same time, there was a group that signed on to this idea of the 4 per meal soil for food security initiative. And the idea was simple enough that it really captured the imagination of a lot of policymakers. And this is an idea that we've been talking about as soil science, as ecologists for a very long time. The vast majority of carbon in our terrestrial system is stored in the surface of our soils. So we have somewhere between 1,500 and 2,400 gigatons of carbon stored locked away in those soils. We know that we're emitting something like 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year through our activities. But if we were able to increase using these regenerative agricultural practices, and we increase the amount of carbon that's currently stored in the soil by just 0.4%, we could offset global emissions by 22 to 35 gigatons, almost the entire annual emissions globally. So this was a back of the envelope calculation. And since 2015, scientists have been scrambling to verify these numbers, to project them with more accuracy, to develop the strategies on the ground that will actually enable this type of program to meet the objectives that we're after. So we also know that soil organic carbon is critical to soil health. So it helps with a range of components that are important to crop productivity. So it improves infiltration, it improves water holding capacity, it increases the ability of the soil to store and cycle nutrients, it increases the soil's tilth, and it can help improve disease resilience. Overall, a healthy soil helps with a healthy crop. So how do we get carbon into our soils? So the main driver of carbon getting into our soils is are plants, and plants through photosynthesis take up carbon dioxide. They, through their residues as they decompose and are decomposed by organisms in the soil, that incorporate these organic residues into the soil, then are transformed through microbial communities into forms of carbon that are more recalcitrant or less likely to be lost to the atmosphere. So these would be the carbon ends up in the biomass of the microorganisms and to non-living, what we call labile carbon, which would be carbon that's easily decomposable, and then relatively stable carbon. And along this microbial pathway, we have respiration. So as microbes are doing this work, some of that carbon goes back up into the atmosphere. So it's a process of trying to create a balance where we're getting more carbon into the soil than back up into the atmosphere. And composting is a really important strategy for doing that. So we know that when we take materials that are of plant origin, whether it's food waste or manures or yard waste, and compost it under anaerobic or aerobic conditions, we still do lose carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. But we're transforming those materials in a way that we can control much better, and then we're able to apply those to agricultural fields or backyards in order to secure the carbon that's remaining in these materials. So a study by Patty et al. In 2005 had a really interesting outcome where they looked at the carbon dioxide equivalents, or the greenhouse gases that were coming from either manure or compost, or manure that had been composted. Thanks, Kate. And their results were really important. So what they showed was stockpiled cattle manure resulted in almost 5 times as much greenhouse gas emissions as the composted version of the cattle manure. Alternatively, slurry cattle manure was 2 times that of compost. So this was dairy cattle manure. And then when we talk about beef cattle manure, it could be almost 4 to 7 times the amount of greenhouse gases that would go into the atmosphere had they not composted that. So compost is a really important, composting in the process itself is a really important way to reduce emissions rather than letting manure or other materials just decompose on their own. So there are, as I said, a number of benefits that have been reported elsewhere. We currently are working on a number of projects in my lab, trying to better understand how to manage compost and nutrients in vegetable production systems to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions and improve the farm's economics. So right now we have experiments running at 2 sites, one on the island in Duncan, Green Fire Farm, and one at the UBC farm, where we're looking at 4 different treatments. One is a control where we're not using any compost. One where we're trying to mimic what farmers are typically using in terms of their application rate. Another is a calculated amount, so how much compost is required to meet the crop's nitrogen needs. And then another that's using a combination of compost and organic certified fertilizer. And we've taken this experiment, and we're doing this on a number of farms around the region, and we've found some really interesting outcomes. So we haven't seen any yield differences, which is really interesting, but what we have seen is the typical application rate has significantly more emissions than our calculated rate, which means that farmers can actually dial back the amount of compost that they're using. What we're uncertain of is whether this trend is going to be something that we'll see in the long term, that maybe that the typical amount that's being applied would actually be building the amount of soil organic matter and sequestering the carbon that would offset these emissions. So there's more work yet to be done. So a healthy soil is a really important component of both adaptation and mitigation. And as I said, compost is a really important component of that. And I think it's really important for everyone to recognize that building a healthy soil is a shared responsibility. It's going to be a responsibility of consumers, scientists, policymakers, and farmers to make the right decision, to develop the right incentives, to make the right purchases. And there's a really great example in California right now where the government has helped incentivize farmers to incorporate compost into their production systems. And in fact, in California, they've committed a substantial amount of money. In 2020, they provided more than 20 million for more than 300 projects to demonstrate how to improve soil health and mitigate climate change. And just today, a really exciting announcement that Canada has now committed 185 million over the next 10 years for agricultural climate solutions. So this is an amazing step. It's really exciting. So what can you do personally? So I applaud you all for being here. That's a great first step. I would then say, take what information that you find out about compost and its relationship to healthy soils and the climate. Tell your friends. Get to know your local farmers and buy local. Pick the farmers that are doing it right. And be willing to spend a little bit more on sustainably grown food. It comes at a cost to do the right thing. And then take advantage of your own land if you have it, or, I have a tiny little deck. I grow some tomatoes, but I don't know much of a part, but it makes me feel connected. And in the end, I highly recommend everybody to compost, or at least, contribute to the green bin instead of putting that in the trash. And hopefully Kayla will provide some more concrete examples of how you engage. So much of the analysis that I talk about is on our website, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that perfect segue. I really appreciated, climate change can be a pretty vast topic to approach, and I think we all learn pretty young that compost is a really important climate solution. But I really appreciate the way that you grounded us in why this issue is so important and such a critical part of the climate solution that we need to be building together in all aspects of our systems and lives. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kayla, who's going to take us from the big picture down to the local. Kayla Siefried is a settler in Lekwungen territory and grew up in Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And Kayla's environmental education began at the University of Waterloo with a Bachelor of Education Studies and continued on with practical hands-on permaculture training and farming internships in various parts on Turtle Island and beyond. Kayla is passionate about sharing her knowledge with people young and old through formal and informal education. And she is the steward of the Compost Education Center demonstration gardens, as well as her own urban backyard garden, boulevard garden, and composting operation. Kayla sees the act of growing food and stewarding the soil as one that can heal on many levels. Kayla, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. And also thanks for the beginning introduction that you offered and territory acknowledgement of where you are in space and how farm folk, city folk is framing your work. I really appreciated that. It seems like some thought has gone into that. So like Kate said, my name is Kayla and I work at the Compost Education Center. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about compost. So as was mentioned in my little intro, I am here on the Lekwungen territory, and the Compost Education Center is also located on unceded and occupied Lekwungen territory. Particularly, I'm on the lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, and the Compost Education Center is just a few blocks away from me here in Fernwood neighborhood in Victoria, British Columbia. So yeah, just want to pay attention to where we are in space. And at the Compost Education Center, our hope really is that by reconnecting people to land-based practices, that they can restore and recreate and heal relationships with the First Peoples whose land we are on. So I wanted to start by just sharing a little bit about the Compost Education Center, just so you know sort of what frame I'm coming from. And the video that you saw about the Vancouver City Farmer space is actually kind of similar to what we offer here in Victoria on Southern Vancouver Island. So we promote composting, soil stewardship, local food production, and ecological conservation by providing all sorts of information and resources, as well as educational workshops on those topics. So we have child, youth, and adult education programs. We have this demonstration site that Kate mentioned that I'm the steward of, that's open to the public for people to come and experience different styles of composting, different styles of organic gardening and permaculture practices, as well as conservation practices in action. And then we have a hotline, so you can pick up the phone and call us with any composting, gardening, or conservation questions that you have. You can also email us as a way to get your questions answered. We have an active membership, and we use volunteers in all aspects of our work. And then we also have a really neat program called Healing City Soils, where we're partnering with a couple different academic institutions to support their research into soil toxicology and how urban dwellers can use low-tech solutions to heal their soils and remediate contaminated soils. So that's a little bit about the Compost Education Center. I just want to tell you a little bit about some benefits of composting, and I think Sean did a good framing of some of those benefits. And so some of this perhaps will be reiteration, but presented in a different way. So there's tons of ecological benefits behind making your own compost and then applying it to soil. And so when we apply compost to any soil, whether it's your backyard garden that you have or on a larger scale on the farming operations that Sean was referring to, it can enhance soil fertility. And rather than instantaneous nutrients, it's sort of this slow release of nutrients over time. A chemical fertilizer, as an opposite, would provide a whole bunch of nutrients all at once and often washes away anyways if it's not applied at the right time. So compost is this really gentle, slow release of nutrients. Compost can improve plant growth, and it introduces a whole lot of life into your soil. And purchased compost doesn't often offer the same as homemade compost. I'm really going to encourage folks to figure out a way that you can make your own compost, because the life that exists, the microbes that exist, and the macrobes, the ones that you can see with your eyes, and the ones that you can't, are so abundant in homemade compost. Whereas sometimes stuff that you buy in a bag for your backyard garden might have been sterilized, and so it won't have the same level of life that exists. And that life really supports this whole intricate food web that exists under the soil that helps your plants to grow and helps plants to also communicate with one another and do all sorts of things for the structure and health of the soil. When we add compost to the soil, there's going to be fewer pathogens and pests, or your plants are just going to be more healthy and robust and able to deal with those pathogens and pests more readily. Compost on soil reduces the erosion of that soil. It improves the soil texture, the soil structure, the soil aeration, and the soil water holding capacity. Adding compost to soil also can adjust the pH, and in this region we tend to have a more acidic pH, which vegetables don't like to grow in. And so if we add compost, it'll slowly creep that pH up a little bit, which can be helpful for those of us who like to grow veggies. And compost has the added magical power of being able to bind certain toxins and make them unavailable. So there's one half of the list of what makes compost so fantastic, but there's also tons of social benefits. So when we are composting our food waste and our yard waste, rather than sending it off to the landfill, we're extending the life of our landfill. On Southern Vancouver Island, we have one landfill, and we want that landfill to last for a very, very long time and not have to find a new one. We turn our waste into a valuable resource when we're composting. We're saving money because we're not going to the garden center and trying to find compost for our gardens every year in the spring. We also are reducing greenhouse gas emissions from landfill when organic matter like food waste and yard waste is kept out of the landfill. Things are compacted down in a landfill and they're surrounded by plastic. And so there's this anaerobic environment, no oxygen. And instead of that organic matter, that, banana peel or apple core, decomposing in something that's going to be beneficial for soil, instead it creates methane gas. Another benefit to composting your food waste and yard waste on your own. Compost can store carbon in the soil and protect the climate, as Sean talked a lot about. It also can build community resilience and power, and we've really seen the importance of having community resilience in this past year of pandemic. It's generally a proactive solution, and it's something that I really believe everybody can do. Just one more further note before I get into the nitty-gritty of how you actually can start composting. So another little note about the connections between composting and climate change is that soil that is nourished with compost creates these really healthy plants. And like Sean said, those healthy plants are able to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and sink it into the soil and keep it there. Composting is preventative in that, we're not putting more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere by sending organic matter to landfill, but it's also corrective. So it can, remove carbon from the atmosphere and sink it into the soil. Organic matter in the form of compost, mulches, manures, that has stored atmospheric carbon in it. And so as a backyard grower or as a farmer, moving around that organic matter in the least amount possible, i.e. digging less, so operating from a frame of no tilling can really be helpful in keeping that carbon in the soil. Because when we plow or rototill, not only are we killing probably a lot of worms that are supportive to a healthy soil food web, but we're also releasing some of that carbon. So operating from a frame of mind of digging in our garden less is better for our backs and better for the environment. Okay, I wanted to give you all a really quick crash course on what it takes to compost in an urban setting at the home scale. So here we go. The basic recipe for a home scale compost would be 1 part greens to 1 part browns. The greens tend to be a lot wetter, they tend to be higher in nitrogen, and the browns tend to be drier and higher in carbon. And when we have that balance of nitrogen and carbon-rich materials, the moisture levels sort of balance one another out, and the chemistry and the biology can happen in such a way that it decomposes into this beautiful finished compost that you can then add onto your soil. So there's a list of the greens and a list of the browns there, very common stuff that you'd have coming out of your kitchen or your yard. And like the fella said in the video at the beginning, hoarding away all those leaves in the fall is a fantastic way to make sure that you have enough leaves for the course of the year, so that every time you're adding some greens into your compost bin, you're right away adding some browns. It's really common. We get the question at the Compost Education Center, my bin is stinky and it's slimy and it's wet, and it's because they haven't added any carbon. They've just been loading it up with all of their greens. So making sure that there's that balance will ensure that you have a really stellar finished compost. Other features that make for a good compost pile include moisture, air, and surface area. So you really want your pile to feel moist like a wrung out sponge. So there's tons of life, like I mentioned, in a compost pile, and that life, just like me and you, it needs water and it needs air. So grab a handful of your compost, see what it feels like. You want it moist like a wrung out sponge, not too wet, not too dry. And then there needs to be air in a compost pile as well for it to be aerobic in the case of an urban style of composting. And so you can bring air into your pile by doing thin layering with the greens and the browns, like I mentioned. The browns tend to be a little bit more fluffy with air layers, whereas the greens tend to sort of stick together. So layering it and then poking your pile. There's a little picture there of a compost aerator. Poking your pile with one of those, or even just with a stick every once in a while, can be really helpful for bringing air into the pile. And then choosing a bin or a style of pile that has airflow from the top, bottom, and sides can also be helpful. And then smaller pieces means faster decomposition, of course. So, if you've got a bunch of garden prunings, cut them up really small before putting them in the compost bin. If you accidentally let some carrots go off in your fridge, I'd say next time maybe cook them into a soup first and freeze them. But if you didn't get to that, then chop them up really small, even if they're mushy and gross, before you put them in your compost bin. That'll just ensure that everything decomposes at a similar rate. So these are some really common options that I just wanted to comment on for folks who live in a smaller scale sort of urban setting. There's the earth machine, which is pictured on the top left here. And then there's the green cone digester, which is a bit of a unique bin. It's not really a compost bin so much as it's a digester, and I'll talk about what that means later. And then there's a Verma compost bin pictured on the bottom left. These are bins that we sell at the Compost Education Center, and I know are available in other places as well. The green cone tends to be a little bit harder to get a hold of, but there's lots of DIY videos on how to make your own digester. So if you can't find one where you're living, fear not, just look up a YouTube video. It'll show you how. I'll also comment just quickly on tumblers and local pickup services. So an earth machine is a passive or a cold type of composting. You're adding the materials as you have them available. Doesn't really need to be in the sun. It's pretty easy to do. You're putting in your fruits and veggie scraps or your green garden waste. Right away, you're putting browns on top, layer, layer, layer. And the cool thing about the earth machine is you can harvest the finished compost from the bottom, add it to your garden while you're still adding raw materials on top. It takes various amounts of time to make finished compost, depending on where your bin is located, how often you're aerating, what the moisture level is, what the contents of your bin is. So it can take any time between 6 months and 2 years. We find that most folks who use their compost bin for all their food scraps and some of their yard waste at least are getting a good haul from their compost bin at least once a year. Here at home, I have 3 earth machines at the moment, as well as other types of composting going. But my 3 earth machines get full every year. So I get to harvest 3 earth machines in the spring, and I use that on my gardens each year. Tumbler compost bins can be easier to aerate. They tend to be more expensive. And if you are, I saw in the poll that many of you are already experienced composters. But if you're new to composting, just be mindful if you wanted to opt for this type of bin that you get a 2-compartment bin so that you can be actively adding raw material to one side while the other side sort of finishes or cures. So that's a tumbler. Verma composting is a fantastic option for people who live in apartments, don't have access to yard space for classrooms or work settings. And it's like revered by gardeners because the finished compost, otherwise known as worm castings or Verma compost, is really nutritious for the garden and for plants in general. It's a really fast compost cycle. It can take a little bit more effort because you have to somehow harvest the finished compost without taking out all the worms so that you can keep feeding the worms. And I should mention this now just so that I don't forget, but it's also posted at the end of the very last slide, that on our website, we've got a whole slew of fact sheets. So if you go to compost.bc.ca, and maybe Kui, you could put that in the chat. On our website, there's a Learn tab and then fact sheets. And there's 20 plus fact sheets there about all different types of composting, gardening, conservation techniques. There's even one there on vermin. It's called vermin resistance. I saw a couple questions coming up about rats and rodents that you might not want in your compost bin. So there's even a fact sheet on that. But there's a fact sheet on Verma composting, and it tells you, the very brief crash course on how to do it. I should also mention that our workshops is a bit of an aside, but I'll get back to it. Our workshops are currently all online. So that means that any of you tuning in from outside of Victoria can totally sign up for our workshops. Some of them are free. We have pay what you can BIPOC tickets, and then they go up to $20. So they're fairly affordable. And you can see all those on our website as well. And we have one coming up about Verma composting. I guess that's why I'm mentioning that. It's in a couple weeks. There's certain things that you don't want to put in a tumbler, in an earth machine, or in a vermicompost bin. That is meat, bones, dairy, oil, breads, grains. And it's not because these things aren't organic matter and that they will decompose. They're all things that will decompose. But in an urban context where there are lots of rodents and creatures, and where things are decomposing at different rates, and where microbes grow on certain things, or bacteria grows on certain things quicker than other things, you want to keep these out of that kind of bin, including diseased plants, noxious weeds, and quote compostable plastics, which just a very quick debunk, not all of them are truly compostable. So be mindful of what you're purchasing there. But all of those that aren't in italics, so even meat-eating animal manure like dog poop, you can put it into a green cone digester. So this is a really nitrogen-rich environment. It's oxygen reduced, so it's not anaerobic, but it's oxygen reduced. It heats up really nicely, and it attracts very particular bacteria and molds that digest food waste into a liquid. The liquid then runs out the bottom of this bin, this black basket that you see pictured here. The liquid runs out there and nourishes the soil that way. So this is a really great urban solution to those hard to decompose items like meat, bones, dairy, cooked foods, even dog waste and pet waste. So it does need a sunny, well-drained location, but this is a really fantastic urban solution. Thank you, Kate. So just a note on some local pickup services. So there's a couple, all three of these are from Victoria area, but curbside collection programs, I can speak for Victoria. They are available in many municipalities, not in all municipalities, but most of that food waste is currently getting trucked fairly far. In the case of many municipalities in the Capital Regional District, they're getting trucked over to the mainland, and we're never seeing that organic matter come back. So I really encourage you, if you aren't able to compost yourself indoors or in your yard, your front yard, backyard, then consider a more local compost pickup service. You can do that research for your own town. So many of you probably know based on what I saw in the poll, but using compost is the funnest part because you've just spent the time putting your organic matter in the right place. And you can use it to top dress plants. It's not strong enough to burn plants like a fresh manure might be. So you can tuck your compost in and around living plants. You can use it when you're transplanting a garden plant. You can use it in potting mixes. You can even make something called compost tea, which we have a fact sheet about. And that's a way to sort of like grow all your microbes so much and then spray it all over your soil and your plants. That is the conclusion of what I wanted to communicate to you all. Those images on the sides of this slide are photos of the fact sheets, some of the fact sheets that we have. So there's lots up there on the website. And I really encourage, if you're ever in Lekwungen territory or if you're ever in Victoria, please stop by and say hey to me and see what's growing in the Compost Education Center's demonstration garden. So thanks very much. I'll pass it back to you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I'm not a home composter right now, but that was such an accessible introduction to how people can get started, and I'm sure it was very, very much appreciated. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of clapping in the chat, so thank you so much. So this is very clearly a community of composting experts, and it looks like folks have been answering each other's composting questions as we go, which is so wonderful. Please continue to do it. But for now, we're going to transition into the Q&A and throw it back to our panelists to answer some of your questions. So I'm going to start us off with a question from Ashley, and this is directed towards Sean, but Kayla, you're also welcome to answer it. And this is about compost incentive plans in BC, which I think, Sean, you touched on right at the end of your presentation. So feel free to talk about compost incentive programs or even the climate solutions funding that you had mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, I guess it is to be seen how that money is going to be rolled out in programs here in BC. So I don't know yet how that federal funding will actually materialize. So Maybe Kayla has some more concrete answers.
Yeah, I'm not sure about province-wide, but I do know that certain municipalities might have certain incentives. Like I know that the city of Victoria currently, they just released this Zero Waste Victoria plan, and they're really working hard to, and they're putting some money behind ensuring that every multi-residential unit has access to some sort of food scrap composting service. So I would maybe check with your local municipality first and see if there's any, composting incentives that way.
Great, thank you so much. Another specific question for Sean, and this is about soil quality. So the question is from Kathy. Any hypotheses on why the Fraser Valley soil quality is declining or not sequestering as much as carbon in the prairie provinces? Are the prairie provinces ahead with respect to regenerative ag practices, or is it the nature of the crops and the products that we're growing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that we're going to try hard to answer. I don't think we have concrete answers at this point. I think it's important to recognize that the data that I show was modeled data, the data that both at the provincial level and the national level is modeled data, as well as the Fraser Valley. So we are right now trying to dig into why we see those differences. But it's clear that the prairies have adopted a no-till agricultural system, and they've been doing this for almost 20 years. And it's largely been enabled through the use of new technologies, Roundup Ready crops. Whether you'd consider that regenerative or not, I think is something to talk about. But certainly in the lower Fraser Valley, we have some very intensive production systems that require that are heavily tilled, and that tillage often results in a loss of carbon to the atmosphere. So it's about providing a balance, and we need to figure out how to help our farmers in this region find the balance between emitting carbon into the atmosphere and putting it back in.
Thanks so much, Sean. Kayla, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's good.
Okay. Next from Audrey, we have a question about invasive plants. And they ask if there's any research about what temperature compost has to achieve in order to render any seeds or plant remains not viable. They mentioned that community composting, which is not in regions where there isn't green waste collection, can inadvertently result in further spread. So any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit about that. I know that in a urban setting where you're backyard composting, if you're doing passive or cold composting, but even if you're doing hot composting, which I do at the Compost Education Center, often the temperature of my pile gets to 55 degrees Celsius, but only really in the center of that pile. And so it's not a controlled enough environment to ensure that the invasive plants and seeds are actually going to die. So what I tend to recommend for people on a small scale, I'm not sure how this would translate on a bigger scale, but on a smaller scale, you can solarize or drown your invasive weeds and seeds. So solarize meaning putting them in a black garbage bag or putting them on a tarp and folding that tarp over and letting the sun cook them over the course of a number of sunny days, or you're putting them in a bucket and you're pouring boiling water over them and letting them sit in that boiling water for a while, and then you can compost those things because you've killed the weed or the invasive plant. And also then I would say check with your local municipality or regional authority on if there's other ways that they would prefer you to deal with some plants that are a little bit more tenacious. They're very smart, those plants. So those are my tips.
Thank you so much. Ashley has a question, a very West Coast question about adding seaweed and specifically bull kelp to your compost.
Yeah, I can say that seaweed is a fantastic addition to compost, or even to directly to your garden bed in the fall, because it'll decompose over the course of winter, and it has lots of little micronutrients. And yeah, the nutrient that exists in the soil, in the ocean ecosystem is really beneficial for the soil ecosystem. So you can do either. You can put it in your compost bin or directly on the soil surface. Bulk kelp tends to decompose a little bit slower because it's much more hardy, but it can just be a mulch even if it's still around in the spring. And then I would just caution people to be really mindful of where they're sourcing their seaweed from, because seaweed's very much a part of that ocean ecosystem. So even when it's up on the shore far, like there's little bugs and critters that are part of, this whole other food web. So just be really mindful of how much you're harvesting, and where you're harvesting from, and don't take too much, I guess, is what I would recommend.
Thanks so much, Kayla. Another question for Sean, and this one is from Michael. So as a member of climatecaucus.ca, which is a collective of 300 plus elected officials across the country who want to start a Farmers for Climate working group, who would be people or groups who we should include as allies to help create strong civic policies to support councillors and mayors across the country?
That's a great question. Yeah, where to start? I think there's probably a long list. A really good connection in BC would be the Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, and I think they're well connected to various players in that space. Yeah, bcacarn.com would be a good place to start.
Kayla, any suggestions to add? Great. And there's lots of resources out there on folks who are doing work to support climate-friendly farming. Farm Folk City Folk is connected to some of them. So if you want more resources on that, we can follow up with you for sure. Maybe as a final question, Michelle wants to know, specifically directed at Sean again, if regenerative agriculture can exist without animals. She says, whenever I hear about RA, it is usually based on animal manure as a soil amendment. So what are the materials in the composts being added to the vegetable trials at farms? Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. And that's one I can't answer. I think it's something that we need to figure out. We certainly can't do it without animals unless we use different practices. So we need to start using more nitrogen fixing cover crops to be able to pull atmospheric nitrogen and put it into our soils. And we need to recycle our own nutrients. So composting is a great way to do that. But we also have our bodily waste that are putting phosphorus and nitrogen back into our environment. Those also could be returned to our production systems. But yeah, right now, most agriculture period is reliant on animals as part of the nutrient cycle. Yeah, and most of the compost that we're using, all the compost that we're using in our trials has some animal waste in it.
Thank you so much. And now, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our Q&A. I know that there are many really wonderful questions that didn't get answered. If you have a question that you're really burning to ask, you're of course more than welcome to stick around with us until 7:30 and take a moment to come off mute and ask it, and maybe crowdsource from all of the composting experts that are here in this space with us. I would just like to really take a moment to thank Sean and Kayla so much for sharing your incredible wisdom and skill as educators with us. I know that I certainly learned a lot, and I imagine that that there was some really incredible information for lots of folks who are here. If you have any appreciation that you want to send Sean and Kayla in the chat, please feel free to. I also want to give a shout out to Coey Taylor, who ran tech support for this webinar, and the whole Farm Folk City Folk team who supported it. Again, this is not the end of the conversation, literally, because you're welcome to stick around after the webinar, but also we just invite you to stay connected with us as Farm Folk City Folk and with all the folks who are doing really critical work in the world of compost. Coey's going to drop some links to some organizations and resources that will be helpful to you in your ongoing learning. And we'll also just invite you to take a look at the participant survey that Coey's going to drop in the chat as well, which we will also send to you in an email after the event. But your feedback is hugely helpful to us in making sure that our events are as relevant and engaging and accessible as possible. So now we'll take a moment to do the raffle draw and pick the lucky winner. So I'm going to share my screen, and Coey has been doing some back-end magic to get you all into this spinner. I'm going to go ahead.
So suspenseful.
I know, it's so suspenseful. It really just keeps going. All right, I think we have David. Is David still in the webinar? Let's see, David, if you're still in the webinar, do you want to just, David's still here. Amazing, congratulations, David. If you want to just stick around long enough for Coey to grab your contact information, we'll make sure to get your gift card to you. Congratulations. So that brings us to the informal end of our webinar. So if you, if you so choose, you can head out now. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here. And if you would like to stick around, you are more than welcome. But for those who, wish, have a wonderful night, and we hope to connect with you again. And for those who are sticking around, we've just changed the settings so that you can unmute yourself if you would like. If you have a question that you would like to ask Kayla or Sean, you're more than welcome to just come off mute and ask it, or chat amongst yourselves. If you have a question for one of the other resident compost experts in the meeting, you're more than welcome to ask them as well. I see a couple folks have their hands raised. Yeah, go ahead.
It's Joyce calling for Sean, and I've heard the, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned composted manure and slurry manure, and a lot of people that I know will advertise that they have old manure. Is that equivalent in value as composted manure?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I don't think it is. I think it's so the study that I presented basically looked at two different ways to store manure. One would be to compost it and then store it, and the other would be just to let it sit out. So I think when you're getting old manure, that would probably be the version that was showing that there was a lot of greenhouse gases. It's basically been sitting on the surface of the soil and emitting nitrous oxide and methane to the atmosphere.
Thank you.
Kara, go ahead.
First of all, thank you. That was super interesting. My question's for Kayla. We're just starting a school garden in Kamloops. So we get a lot of snow in the winter. Well, not a lot, but we get snow, and then we get super hot in the summer. We're also in conjunction with the garden running a compost, and there's already two of the, I don't know which ones they're called, but those big green, all like enclosed ones at the school. Are those good for being like, because they're basically left without having anything done to them for 2 months in the summer, right? When there's nobody at the school. Is there a better compost for that type of system, or are those ones good? Or
Yeah, I think you're speaking of the tumbler. You're speaking of the ones that you can aerate and they're above ground. They're like off the ground.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I feel like there's no harm in leaving it for 2 months. It'll just complete its decomposition phase. And so then in the fall, in September, if you wanted to do a lesson around adding the compost to the soil and planting some arugula that'll grow really fast, or some lettuce that'll grow really fast, you could have a little fall crop after adding that compost. So yeah, there's no problem in it sitting there, so long as you've been doing the 1 part greens, 1 part browns, and while you are at school aerating and ensuring the moisture is good to go, then yeah, I think that's a totally fine bin to have. Yeah, and of course there's lots of other options for different styles of bins, but that's very similar to other passive cold composting bins, when you're just adding the materials as you have them available and they don't require attention every day or anything like that. So I think you'd be good.
Awesome. Thank you.
I might just interrupt or interject quickly to ask a question on behalf of someone in the chat. Ashley had a question about how their in-laws had asked them not to use manure when making compost because they're concerned about salmonella or other viruses. Do you think that's a concern? It sounds like manure is important to add to compost.
I can just comment that if it's meat-eating animal manure, then it's one thing, and if it's and from my knowledge, if it's a different type of animal manure, like the common ones that are used in gardening, so cows, chickens, hog manure, llama manure, alpaca manure, rabbit manure, they're pretty gentle and don't, from my knowledge, so long as you're not applying like fresh out of the animal manure directly to something that's already got leafy greens above soil, like that's going to kill the plant anyways, because it'll be too full of nitrogen and it'll burn your plant, so you wouldn't want to do that anyways. But I personally wouldn't be worried about pathogens or salmonella, because there's such an intricate web of things happening in a compost pile. So if you're adding raw fresh manure to a compost pile that's from herbaceous eating animals, and you're combining it with the right amount of carbon containing materials like leaves, it'll decompose over the course of time into something that's a really nice compost. I don't know if Sean, you want to add anything to that?
Well, there's lots of great nutrients in there, so that would be the advantage of using animal products or animal manure in the compost, would be the phosphorus and nitrogen rich components to it.
And maybe I can just add further to that. I know Sean mentioned very briefly about humanure, so making use of our own body's wastes. And there's a really good old classic book that lots of permaculturists and regenerative agriculturists look to, which is called the Humanure Handbook. There's also the Essential Composting Toilets book, which is written by a couple actually on Southern Vancouver Island here. And it gets really technical and into the nitty gritty, but things that animals that are eating meat, including ourselves, our wastes are different, and so they need to be treated differently, as in they need to have a combination of time and heat applied to those wastes in order for them to be safe for us to use on our gardens, say, or on our fields. So those are a couple other resources you could check out.
Thanks, Kayla. Ruth, I see your question in the chat. I'm going to go to Nav and let them ask theirs, and then I'll ask yours next.
Hello, hi. That's the same question I have in chat. So in Richmond, we have a farm. It's a blueberry farm, but we also grow vegetables. But our soil is clay-based, so it gets quite hard. We do add manure, but how can we avoid tilling when we plant our seeds, and also to manage weeds?
Yeah, that's a tough one in clay soil. So building organic matter takes time, and one important strategy for building a soil that you can reduce tillage on would be to increase the aggregates in your soil. And one important way to do that would be to incorporate cover crops or other deep-rooted crops into the rotation. And I think many of the farmers that I work with in Delta, where the soil can so easily get compacted and really clawed up, it's a terrible cycle where you feel like you got to till heavily to get it to a workable state, and that's exactly the opposite direction that you want to be going. By reducing the tillage, by increasing the organic matter, you can then get to a point where you get to that soil tilth that ultimately will enable you to reduce the tillage to control weeds. But it takes time, it takes a concerted effort. Yeah, there are only a few farmers that I know in the Delta region on heavy clay soils that are able to do that. But it took a while, so be patient, stay at it, and yeah, try to incorporate those cover crops.
So how long does it take for that? Just approximate.
I mean, years. It would be. I mean, there are some farmers that I could connect you with that probably would be able to tell you how long it took them. I think that finding people that are using similar cropping systems that you are, and connecting with them is a really good way to figure out the pathway to reduce tillage and increase soil health, reduced compaction. Those are. Yeah, there are a few stellar farmers down in Delta who figured it out that I certainly could point you to.
Oh, perfect. That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been very helpful.
I might just keep going back and forth between folks who are still asking questions in the chat, which is wonderful. So I see everyone who has your hand up. And we will get to you. So Ruth had a question in the chat, which was, my understanding is that the key to great compost that positively impacts the soil is the abundance and diversity of microbes and fungi. Do you have any suggestions on how to best increase these in our home composts?
I would just say that incorporating a wide variety of different materials in your compost pile can be beneficial. So yes, you can make a compost pile with your apple tree windfall and some dry brown maple leaves, but the health and diversity of that finished compost is going to be a little less than if you're using some apple windfall, some brown maple leaves, some fruits and veggie scraps from your kitchen, some coffee grounds that you got at the local coffee shop, a few shovelfuls of horse manure, a bunch more brown leaves. So the diversity of microbes that's going to attract, grow, and proliferate, as well as macrobes, is going to be better than just a smaller variety of materials that you're adding. It's sort of like our diet, right? So if we have a really variable, healthful, whole food diet, we're going to be, better off than if we just eat white bread and peanut butter every single day for 3 meals. So that would be my tip, to bring in a lot of healthy life into your compost pile. And then you can also grow and encourage the health of microbes directly in your soil by keeping your soil covered with mulch like 365 days a year. So in an urban context, this is easy. Nav was talking about maybe a bigger scale as a farmer, so that might get a little bit more difficult. But as much as you can, keeping the soil covered with leaves or straw or something to protect that soil, and it decomposes and it attracts and builds microbes and soil health and all of that as well. So yeah, keeping your soil covered would be another way to grow microbes and support their health directly in the soil.
Thanks so much, Kayla. I'll pass it to Ren.
Hi, thanks for putting on this wonderful webinar. First of all, I did want to ask, I have a small farm, and so we have stuff in the field, we also have animals, and then our food scraps. I'm trying to find a way to kind of combine everything so we don't have just multiple piles everywhere. We don't also have any machinery. So we have chicken manure mixed in with wood chips. We have sheep manure mixed in with hay straw and wood chips. Just general weeds from the farm, and also kitchen scraps, which does include like raw chicken parts and bones and stuff. Is there a way to combine this all? How do you think I should handle it if I'm doing everything by hand without machines?
I could offer some tips, and then Sean, I don't know if you have any ideas from your experience on farms, but I would recommend some sort of hot compost bin. So we have a fact sheet it's fact sheet number 4, and it's on hot composting. It offers a protocol for like a fairly it's a protocol, i.e. it requires work and it requires checking on your pile every day, where you're heating your pile to a certain temperature, and you're moving it through different bins. There's a better way to describe that. You're flipping your pile a certain amount of times and letting it rise to 55 degrees Celsius a number of times, so it decomposes all those materials quite quickly. With the raw chicken parts, I might encourage you to do more research on that, because I don't know directly, or maybe Sean knows something about that. But in terms of like a hand, no machinery, definitely. And we also have a plan on our website for how to build a pallet 3-bin hot compost system. So check that out. So you've got like old pallets that make up these bins that you can flip from one to the next. And all of those materials that you mentioned, maybe the raw chicken materials, I would do more research on that. But all the other materials you mentioned could definitely go in that hot compost pile.
Perfect, thank you.
Pass it to Kathleen. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
I was just going to ask Ren, how much material are we talking about? Are you able to actually move it around by hand?
It's usually, I'd say probably like an average wheelbarrow, probably like 10 to 20 wheelbarrow barrel loads per month. So it's enough that it's annoying, I could say, but not unmanageable.
I guess it comes down to the amount of labor you have versus the amount of land you have, because certainly things will compost in a static pile if you have enough time. So aeration definitely is the way to decompose more rapidly. But if you have land space, you could rely on time to help you out. It will eventually become a nice compost, but you need some space to do it.
Yeah, so far we've been relying on time and just using up a lot of space.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ren. I'll pass it to Kathy.
As in me. Yeah. Actually, this is related to Ruth's question about, increasing the abundance and diversity of microbes, et cetera, in home compost. But I recently saw it was like some kind of an agricultural seminar where there's a company that was making microbial cocktails for agricultural applications. And I was curious as to whether or not it was for applying directly to the soil for helping with plants growing and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, Sean, if you are aware of similar things having to do, to help with sort of more rapid composting of animal manures or improving, I guess, the emissions profile coming off of, manures that are applied to fields.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of work done in I would say the non-university, non-research world on using effective microorganisms for enhancing various things like composting, improving pest resilience, and perhaps reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But this is just now taking hold in sort of the more mainstream research world, and so we're just starting to see some really exciting research come out on that. Some of my colleagues at UBC are working on that. So I can't comment on the validity of the work that has not been peer reviewed, but it certainly seems promising. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the research findings that should be coming out soon.
Oh, okay, that sounds cool. Because I hear a lot of buzz about the effective microorganisms, et cetera, but it does seem to be anecdotal. So.
Yeah,
okay.
and I mean, there are a lot of people who are very excited about it, and it sort of builds this excitement. And I think you should be aware of, there are some snake oils out there, and to be cautious, and to look for some people who have had at least good experiences with it, that it before really committing to it, or doing the experiments yourself.
Yeah.
Try it out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. James, did you want to go ahead?
Yes. So for Sean or Kayla, you described using a lot of different composts, because it creates a diversity of the microactivity. Whether you go to a field and you can get some, instead of staying with just white bread all the time, as you would describe it, Kayla, you could, and it was a concept I learned from an old, Romanian farmer years ago. He says, there's no one good compost, just go and get lots of everything. And it really stuck with me. And now when a person takes something like Gaia Green, which is an organic granulated fertilizer or a natural fertilizer, which contains, alfalfa, bone meal, blood meal, glacial rock dust, bat guano, fossilized carbon complex, rock phosphate, and you mix all those things into the soil without the use of compost, are those ingredients just stimulating the microactivity that's existing already in the soil to deliver the nutrients, to build the soil and deliver the nutrients through the roots and up to the plant?
My understanding would be no, that those nutrients are going to feed the plants, and that they might not as much feed the microbes that are in the soil. It's the organic matter that's going to feed the microbes and support their intricate web of the ways in which that they support the plants to grow. Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, I would just say that the microbes in the plants can often be competing for the same nutrients, and the challenge with using a product like Gaia Green that doesn't have carbon coming in with it, and that's what's, the vast amount of compost is made of carbon, and microbes, their bodies are basically an 8 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if you're just putting in nitrogen, the microbes have all the nitrogen they need, but they don't have the carbon they need. And what ends up happening is that they consume all the carbon that's been stored in the soil then to do their processes. So that's where we end up seeing, particularly in, I mean, it's the same approach as a conventional farmer would use by adding synthetic fertilizer that doesn't have a carbon input to it. Eventually, those microbes are going to consume whatever residual carbon is in the soil.
Oh, very interesting. Because I actually had spoken to the the owner of the company, and he had said, yeah, it stimulates microactivity, but it, from how you're describing it, sounds a bit more accurate in the sense where it's really feeding the plant, not really stimulating the microactivity in that sense.
Well, it can be stimulating the microbial activity, but it's consuming the carbon that's in the soil. So that you're adding the nitrogen that the microbes want, but not the carbon. So they got to get it from somewhere else.
Right. Okay. And then another question I had was, I guess it was just, or maybe it was an experience to share, is when somebody had brought up, I think it was Kathy or somebody brought up the whole question of effective microorganisms, and that's a really interesting, intricate topic, and I've been doing some experimenting with them over the last decade, and have just seen some phenomenal results from my aunt not being able to plant garlic effectively, and then giving her a solution that I had created, and all of a sudden she's able to actually grow garlic out, and just eliminating garlic fungus just by shifting up, by using the effective microorganisms, because it's just what you guys are talking about, which is fascinating, which is just diversifying the microactivity in the soil. So really neat stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. We are coming up on 7:30, unfortunately, and it feels horrible to cut anybody off. If there is someone who wants to ask the final question to wrap us up, I know Kathy has their hand up, and there's a couple folks who had questions earlier on in the chat. So if you are one of the askers of the earlier question and you're still looking for an answer, maybe just drop something in the chat right now, and then otherwise I'll hand it over to Kathy. Okay, Kathy, floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had a question actually for Kayla about what would be a good gateway compost for someone. I know someone who wants to compost. She thinks it's a good idea, but she's totally squeamish, right? We suggested worm composting. She's like, no, don't want that. And it's like, no, there's too many flies. So.
Right.
And and seeing that you've taught people how to compost, and you've seen people go from one stage to another, is there a solution?
Yeah, if that person has yard space at all, I would really recommend a green cone. So it's a digester. It's not a typical compost bin, but it's ease of all ease. Like, it's super easy to use. You literally just add your food waste to it. You don't have to add any browns. And you don't actually harvest finished compost from it. So it's a fantastic food waste diversion technique, and it also requires no labor really in terms of harvesting the compost. So they wouldn't have to deal with the worms and the bugs if they're not into it. And then in terms of like flies in the kitchen, when you're storing your food scraps, tell them that they can freeze the food scraps. Doesn't attract the fruit flies, and then they can put frozen food scraps out into their compost bin. Yeah. And if the green cone isn't available or they're not up for it, then the passive cold compost, so the earth machine that I mentioned in my little presentation, Once you get the swing of it, it's pretty easeful as well. You just add the materials as you have it available. Though she would have to harvest the finished compost and make use of it every once in a while. And if she had if she had a gardening friend, I'm sure that a gardener would take that compost off of her hands for her if she wasn't up for harvesting it. So
Yeah.
those are the tips I'll offer. And you can find out about the green cone on our website.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
That was a great question to end on. Thank you so much for everyone who stuck around. We thought maybe a handful of people would stick around for the open discussion, and it's wonderful to see so many engaged folks here with really excellent questions. Sean and Kayla, if you feel comfortable sharing, how could people follow up with you if they have other questions, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, do you have any final resources that you'd like to share with folks before we send people out into their evening?
I think I've already, shared the Compost Education Center's website a bunch of times. Really encourage people to check out our fact sheets. We've also got a ton of videos. Growing food together is another really neat collaboration of a number of different organizations in Lekwungen territory that came together at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's so many cool videos on sustainable gardening practices. So Growing Food Together is a website I would look up. And then you can always give us a call at the Compost Ed Center if you have questions. Our number's on our website.
And I would say, feel free to email me, sean.smuckler@ubc.ca. Otherwise, my lab has a website, Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab. If you just Google Sol Lab, it should come up. And we have a lot of our research results up there. And yeah, if I can't answer the question, I'm happy to connect you to someone who might.
Great. Okay, thank you again, everyone, so much for being here and giving your evening to learn with us. Please stay connected to us. Please keep doing good work, and have a wonderful evening.
Really awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for organizing. Great job.
Sure. Take care.
Good night.